Everyone knows the standard opening advice: control the center, develop your pieces, castle. And after that, rebellious spies usually focus only on their own ideas, forgetting about the importance of prophylaxis or even about countering the opponent's plans. And today, in a single video, I'll share with you two key ideas on how to counter your opponent's pieces and prevent them from carrying out their plans. We'll get acquainted with these ideas through examples. And the first piece we'll start fighting against is the knight. How annoying it is. How many forks has it delivered? And how much material has it won from you? If you see your opponent's knight on squares like b6, b3, g3 or g6, then it's a good idea to try to restrict it and turn it into a clumsy piece. How are we going to do that? We'll restrict it with pawns. In other words, it's prophylaxis against the knight. We play g3 to restrict the knight's access to squares like g6, h4, and f4, first of all. And the main idea is then to push the h-pawn forward to drive the knight on g6 even further away. And here, white isn't even worried about their pawn on a4 being attacked, because if black takes it, their position simply collapses and white's pieces dominate the board. If black doesn't take the pawn, then the knight is still driven back and gradually turns into a clumsy piece. And white seizes the initiative. Next example. You immediately notice white's knight on g3. What should we do with it? All of white's pieces are more or less well placed. And our task is to try to worsen their position to prevent the opponent's plans. And of course, here we push the h-pawn forward since it's well supported. And our idea is to play h4 next, to drive the knight away as far as possible. If we are met with the move h4, then in that case we retreat the knight to h7, and it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to defend the pawn on h4. It turns out that it's impossible to prevent the move h4. Our pawn advances, and we worsen the opponent's knight by driving it back. The knight goes to h5. Black's plan is quite clear. Play g5, go f4, seize space on the king side, and put white in an uncomfortable position. If white tries to prevent this with the move knight to f4, then we capture, give a check on d4, and after king h1, g5, the bishop on f4 is lost. In their attempt to avoid leaving their knight in a bad position, white forgot that they are losing their bishop here. Let's move on. A similar situation. White's last move was knight to g3. Ask me, what should we do next? Of course, we play h5. Our pawn moves out of attack and advances forward to once again force white to think about their knight on h4. In this situation, h4 is a possible move because the pawn is supported by the rook. But in the future, this pawn could become a target for our attack. It will also be advantageous to retreat the knight to h7, preventing the bishop from going to g5 and forcing the rook to worry about that pawn on h4. If our advance is not challenged, then white's knight will be forced into an unfavorable position. Once again, we are taking preventive measures, understanding that our opponent wanted to play bishop to g5. We retreat the knight to h7, don't let it go there and end up with a simply magnificent position. The knight moves to e5, the bishop comes out to h6 if the knight goes to e3, and black has not a single problem on the board. The pawn then advances to f5. Black's position is simply excellent. In the next diagram, white's knight on b3 dreams of getting to c5 and causing us some problems. Maybe, even if it gets to c5, after we chase it away, it might move to d3. So what should we do? We focus on restricting the knight. Always remember that for a knight to feel comfortable on the board, it needs outposts. And we restrict it and try to drive it back. Of course, we will play a5. If the knight goes to c5, we'll play b6. There's also the option here to play b6 right away. And probably that would be a better decision, so the knight can't even get to c5, and after the move rook to c1, we play a 5, also with the further idea of playing a 4. For example, if white tries to interfere, then we centralize the king, because the endgame is near. And if the opponent's knight wants to go to b5, first of all, we have the prophylactic idea of moving our knight to a 7, or we can just ignore it, put our knight on f5, and if the knight goes to b5, simply keep advancing. Yes, we let the knight onto b5, but the knight on b3 is out of play. Our pieces are well placed. The bishop comes out to b4 since we forced the opponent to push their pawn forward and also secured an outpost for ourselves. But you might ask me, what if the knights are positioned differently? Well, let's try to figure it out. When you see your opponent's knight on the board, try to understand where it wants to go. Because one way or another, the opponent will most likely try to bring their knight to some active positions in the center. And if they have outposts, then the knight will definitely aim for those squares. Try to restrict it as much as possible. In any position, try to think about whether you can somehow prevent your opponent's knight from occupying a good square. Here you see that black has a knight on b7. Where does it want to go? Well, obviously the knight wants to get to c5, and then even if we attack it on e6 to move on from there. So restrict the knight, keep it on b7 and play b4. Apply your prophylactic thinking. Because now the knight can't go anywhere. And if black tries to undermine with a pawn move, we play b5 and destroy black's pawn structure, creating weaknesses for them. If c5 follows, then after capturing, we've left the opponent with an extremely weak pawn on d6 and continue our development with the aim of attacking this pawn. In this position, where do you think the white knight wants to go? Of course, the white knight is aiming for the d5 square. It wants to get there. So just go ahead and restrict it. Don't let it reach the outpost, play c6 and take control of that square, thereby limiting your opponent's knight and creating problems for them in deciding exactly what to do with the knight on c3. Now let's move on to the second prophylactic technique. And let's talk about bishops. What about your opponent's bishops? The best prophylactic technique against your opponent's bishops is a pawn barrier. Set it up and turn your opponent's bishop into a pawn. On the board, you can see the bishop on b7 is active, putting pressure on our e4 pawn. How can we turn it into something useless? Of course, play f3 to protect the pawn this way. The pawn on e4 controls the important d5 square. The f3 pawn defends the pawn and simply puts the bishop in an awkward position. White has two bishops. The dark squared bishop is good and active. Now let's bring the rooks over. We have a position with an advantage. In the next diagram, we see that white has an interesting battery of queen and bishop. The bishop is in front, and both are aiming at the g7 pawn. How do we deal with this? Let's figure it out. Of course, the first thing we do is place the pawn on e5. First, we're driving the knight out of the center, and second, we're about to block the bishop. The knight moves to f3, and we play knight to f4 with tempo, attacking the f2 pawn. Don't forget that we should also check our own ideas, despite the opponent's threats. And attacking the e2 pawn is much more important than our pawn on e5. The opponent plays knight to d3, defends everything, and we play f6, reinforcing the pawn on e5, setting up a barrier for the opponent's bishop and turning it into a bad piece. Black's position here leaves no room for doubt. I think you've already grasped the main idea. Take a look at the position on the board and carefully think about what move black should make now. Well, of course, I would name the move knight to f6. The white dark squared bishop is about to be completely shut down. If they play the bishop to d4, then we play e5, and after bishop takes b6, we capture the rook and then take the a pawn. Even though we have doubled pawns, the opponent's knight doesn't control any squares. Our rook is active and the pawn on a 3 is weak. We're also combining the previous theme here by restricting the opponent's knight. But if the bishop doesn't go there, we play e5, take control of the crucial d4 square, and the white bishop feels extremely uncomfortable. Black's position also raises no questions, and there are no issues at all. Now let's reinforce what we've learned. White to move, friends. Come on, now everyone on the other side of the screen, out loud, all together. What move do we make? e4. The black's light squared bishop is shut in. We've set up a barrier for it. And by the way, we've also restricted the knight on f6. Now the bishop on b7 is blocked by our pawns. And our bishop wants to go to e3. Yeah. And here white also has a significant, quite comfortable advantage in the position. Keep in mind that if you have fianchettoed bishops, it's preferable, if possible, not to let your opponent set up a barrier. In this situation, for example, even though the pawn on b4 is under attack, you should play e5 and not let your opponent advance their pawn to e5 themselves and shut in your bishop. If they take the pawn on b4, white has a considerable lead in development, even though the queens are off the board. And now we'll bring our rooks into play, create problems for the opponent, and develop our initiative. So, e5 is a necessary move in response to the opponent's e5. I hope this video was extremely useful for you and that you will successfully use these prophylactic techniques in your own games.